This video will cover everything you need to get started with file classifications in NVivo. We have already covered case classifications in the NVivo for Windows Fundamentals course. As you can see, we've created a case for each person in the study and coded the data we have so far for each person into that case. We then created a case classification for people and called it person, and inside we created the attributes age and gender. Once this was done, we assigned the classification person to some of our participants. And then we opened the case classification sheet and assigned values to two of the attributes, gender and age. While case classifications are linked to our units of analysis, file classifications are about the characteristics of our data, both files and externals. So if we are doing a literature review, you would have a file classification of reference. That would have attributes, type of reference, date of publication, author, etc. In this project, we have two types of data, interviews and newspaper articles, so we can create two types of classification for interviews and newspaper articles. In the navigation view, I'm selecting the Files Classification folder. Then, on the Create tab, I'm selecting File Classification. I will name it Interviews and click OK. I'll create another file classification and call it Newspaper Articles. I will now create file attributes for interviews by selecting the classification, then right-clicking to choose New Attribute. I will name the attribute Interviewer. Its type is the default text, and I will add the following values by clicking the Values tab, then clicking Add. The values are Henry, Linda, Nancy, and Elizabeth. Once I have added all of the values, I click OK to close the Attribute Properties dialog box. I will then create a second attribute for interviews and call it Date. I can change the type to Date. I do not need to create the values beforehand. I can add them when I assign the values to the files, so I'll just click OK to create this attribute. I will now create an attribute for newspaper articles. I first select the newspaper articles classification type. Then right-click to choose New Attribute. I will name it Reporter, and the type is text. I will also create another one for publication date by once again right-clicking, New Attribute, naming it, choosing the type, and then clicking OK. In the navigation view, I will select my folder for interviews. Then, in List View, I select all of the interviews by holding my Shift key. By right-clicking over the list, I can select the classification, File Classification Interviews. Next, I'll select the News Articles folder and repeat this process for the news articles, but this time I will classify them as newspaper articles. To assign the values, I'll open the classification sheet for interviews by selecting in the navigation view File Classifications, then right-clicking on Interviews and selecting Open Classification Sheet. I can use the drop-down arrow to select the values that I have already entered, or I can type in new values if required. We will talk more about attributes and their role in analysis as we discuss queries.